the real reasons why most ufologists are watched by government, and it's not what you think. It's a fact that over the decades, more than a few people in ufology have been watched by governments all around the world, and there are more than a few of these ufologists who conclude officialdom is watching them because they're getting too close to the quote unquote truth. Maybe on some occasions that's true. Most of the time, though, it's all down to politics. And as you'll see now, we'll begin with the most famous controversial contactee, George Adamski. And as evidence of this, close to 400 pages of FBI documentation on Adamski have now been declassified. An FBI document of May 28, 1952 reveals that Bureau agents had a credible source who back in 1950, no less than 3 years before Flying Saucers Have Landed was published, had shared with them certain disturbing data on Adamski. The FBI took, and to this day continues to take, careful steps to ensure that the source's name would not be compromised. What we do know is that the FBI's informant claimed to have seen Adamski in the presence of a group of Russians in downtown Los Angeles, California, on several occasions in 1950, discussing politics no less. Unfortunately, the available censored papers don't specify where exactly in LA the meetings occurred, or under what particular circumstances, nor do we know who was responsible for the source of the story. We also have to wonder how the source was so absolutely certain that the group were Russians. Was he or she conversant in Russian? Did the source recognize the accent? Were they themselves Russian too? If so, what were they doing in Los Angeles? Of great concern, however, was the fact that Adamski's followers, which reached six figures in number after the 1953 book Flying Saucers Have Landed was published, were hanging on his every word. That included those words which were relative to the way of the life of the Russians. The FBI file continues, Adamski, during his conversation, made the prediction that Russia will dominate the world and we will then have to have an era of peace for 1,000 years. He stated that Russia already has the atom bomb and the hydrogen bomb, and that the great earthquake, which was reported behind the Iron Curtain recently, was actually a hydrogen bomb explosion being tried out by the Russians. Adamski states this earthquake broke seismic machines. He added that no normal earthquake can do that. The FBI continued, Adamski stated that within the next 12 months, San Diego would be bombed. Well, all this, of course, did not take place. Adamski stated that it does not make any difference if the States has more atom bombs than Russia, and as much as Russia needs only 10 of them to cripple the States by placing these simultaneously in such spots as Chicago and other trivial centers of the country. Adamski further stated that the States today is in the same state of deterioration as the Roman Empire prior to its collapse, and it will fail just as the Roman Empire did. He stated the government in this country is a corrupt form of government, and capitalists are enslaving the labor. It's no surprise that the FBI was concerned that Adamski was using the UFO phenomenon to spread communism. And now moving on. Now to the 1960s and the Aetherius Society, one of the most known UFO organizations of that era. So far as can be determined, George King and his Aetherius Society did not attract the secret attention of the world of officialdom until 1957. Specifically in May of that year, it was on the 26th of the month that an eye-catching article appeared in the pages of a weekly UK-based publication called The Empire News, in an article titled Flying Saucer Club's Probe, Peace Messages from Outer Space. The following was revealed. Warnings from outer space against Britain's H-bomb test published in a Flying Saucer magazine take a similar line to Moscow-inspired propaganda. The warning, quote-unquote, in a special issue of the magazine is being scrutinized by Scotland Yard's special branch, the origins of which date back to 1883, and which in 2006 was absorbed into the Metropolitan Police Service's Counterterrorism Command. It's suspected that a number of flying saucer clubs, and some spiritualists as well, are unwittingly being used by the communists. The warning appeared in the magazine of the Aetherius Society, which circulates widely among flying saucer enthusiasts. Not only that, the Empire News revealed that George King had, as he put it, received a channeled message from advanced entities from the planet Mars. Its decidedly anti-nuke message went as follows, quote, "Have not the latest peace moves come from Russia? You in the West blame Russia and say it's necessary to take those weapons to protect yourselves from them. You in Britain are in favorable position to show the larger countries the way. It's hardly surprising that a body like Special Branch would sit up and take notice of A, this development in the world of Ethereal society, and B, the pro-Russian words of the Martians." King wasted no time in contacting Scotland Yard, demanding to know why exactly he and his group were now under surveillance by government authorities. Well, given both the time frame and the climate, it should have been glaringly obvious. The authorities saw King's words and those of his claimed Martian friends as nothing less than outright propaganda designed to make the UK government look bad and the Russians look good. Gerald K. Haynes, in his position as historian of the National Renaissance Office, wrote a paper titled CIA's Role in the Study of UFOs, 1947 to 1990. It's now in public domain, thanks to the provisions of the Freedom of Information Act, and it can be read at the CIA's website. Haynes' paper detailed the history of how and why the CIA became interested and involved in the phenomenon of UFOs. Although Haynes covered a period of more than 40 years, I'll bring your attention to one particular section of the paper, which he focused on the 1970s and 80s. He wrote, "During the late 1970s and 80s, the agency continued its low-key interest in UFOs and UFO sightings. While most scientists now dismiss flying saucer reports as a quaint part of the 1950s and 60s, some in the agency and the intelligence community shifted their interest to studying parapsychology and psychic phenomena associated with UFO sightings. CIA officials also looked at the UFO problem to determine what UFO sightings might tell them about Soviet press in rockets and missiles and reviewed its counterintelligence aspects. The Soviets then were camouflaging their secret rockets test by spreading false and fantastic tales of UFOs. Haynes also noted something that's absolutely key to the story that this book tells, and particularly so with regard to the Majestic 12 papers. Quote, "Agency analysts from the Life Science Division of OSI and OSWR officially devoted a small amount of their time to issues relating to UFOs. These included counterintelligence concerns that the Soviets and the KGB were using U.S. citizens and UFO groups to obtain information on sensitive U.S. weapons development programs, such as the stealth aircraft, the vulnerability of the U.S. air defense network to penetration by foreign missiles mimicking UFOs, and evidence of Soviet advanced technology associated with UFO sightings. One of those who in the 1950s took a deep interest in the Russian connection to the flying saucer phenomena was the late Jim Moseley, who died in 2012 at the age of 81, and whose opinions on George Adamski we have already digested. For the ufologically minded, Moseley was without a doubt most associated with his highly entertaining newsletter, Saucer Smear. It was a semi-regular, self-published collection of Moseley's comments, rants, and observations of the UFO research scene. Moseley was someone who in later years focused just about all of his time and efforts on poking fun at ufologists whenever and wherever he could. He did so in a very witty fashion too. I should stress, though, that Moseley did have a real deep interest in the UFO phenomenon itself, and a firm belief in it too, right up until the time of his death. What Moseley found out as he traveled from New York City to California and back again was a significantly varied, entertaining collection of eccentricities, liars, nut jobs, and, to Moseley's self, genuinely interesting eyewitness to strange aerial craft in the skies of 1950s America. Although Moseley interviewed around 100 people on a clunky big recorder, which was no mean feat, the list of interviewees included George Adamski himself and Frank Scully, with the man whose 1950 book Behind the Flying Saucers led to Silas Newton's secret recruitment by agents of the U.S. government, as revealed by CIA late Carl Flock. Moseley's coast-to-coast trip was funded by a guy named Ken Crippen. He was a somewhat shady, dubious character who suggested that if he, Mosley, would do all of the research, then Crippen would write a book on Mosley's UFO findings. The two would then split the profits right down the middle. Sounds good, right? Well, for a while, yes, it sounds very good. The proposed book, however, did not materialize, at least not as Mosley and Crippen had originally planned things. No, it wasn't due to the infernal intervention of the mysterious men in black. Rather, it was all due to the distinct lack of interest on the part of just about every publisher that Mosley approached with his well-thumbed and increasingly creased and crumpled manuscript. Mosley was not to be daunted, however. Years later, decades in fact, he put just about all of his old notes and audio recordings to good use in his hilarious autobiography, shockingly close to the truth, which was written with Karl Plock. It was in 1955 that Mosley, his own words, had fallen under the influence of a man named Charles Shamwick. The latter was someone who, before retiring from the U.S. Army, worked in the Hall and Mirrors-filled world of counterintelligence, which included keeping a very close eye on what the Russians were said to be up to inside the United States. Not only that, Mosley was able to determine that Shamwick had, in some hazy, unclear fashion, ties to the CIA's Robertson's panel, and had once helped to bust a Soviet spy ring in Washington, D.C. Shamwick and Mosley soon became good buddies, with Mosley somewhat dazzled and disturbed by one particular thing that Shamwick had said. He told Mosley, quote, "The Communist Party has planted an agent in every civilian saucer club in the United States," end quote. Now let's focus on Truman Bethurum. He was a contactee who had a decade or so of fame in the arena of the Space Brothers. His 1954 book, Aboard a Flying Saucer, remains a contactee classic of its kind. Jim Mosley got to know Bethurum well. In the 1950s, Bethurum claimed flirty, late-night close encounters with a beautiful alien space babe named Aura Raines. Quote, "top in shapeliness and beauty," end quote, was the way Bethurum described the captain of the ship. The locations of all the actions were almost always isolated areas of Nevada's expansive Mormon mountains. Most ufologists of the day, very understandably, dismissed Bethurum's tales as fantasies run wild and free. It's intriguing, however, to note the following words from Bethurum, quote, "2 or 3 fellows who had sons in Korea and who read a lot in the newspapers about the communist underground in this country were convinced in their own minds that I was, if making contact with anyone at all, making it with the enemy agents. They even went so far as to tell me belligerently that they intended to get guns and follow me nights, and if they caught up me having intercourse with any people from planes, airships of any kind, they'd blast me and those people too," end quote. Was Aura Raines a figment of Bethurum's imagination? Could she have been an alien? Might she have been one of those enemy agents, quote-unquote, to which Bethurum referred? A Russian plant seeking to manipulate the UFO scene? Taking into consideration all that we've learned so far, we should not dismiss the latter possibility out of hand. On a related matter, it's worth noting that FBI records demonstrated that in December 1954, the Palm Springs Republican Club contacted the FBI to inquire if Bethurum might be guilty of, quote, "trying to put over any propaganda," end quote. Now, with all of the above said, it's absolutely clear that government agencies during the Cold War were taking deep interest in Russia, flying saucers, and communism all in one, and it was for those reasons that the files were opened on ufologists by the FBI, not because of aliens. This is by Nick Redfern on Mysterious Universe. Please leave your comments. Thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.